Go.
Streaming from South Africa to the world. This is the Stonks Go Moon podcast. What just happened? We break it down so you don't have to.
Welcome everyone to the Stonks Go Moon podcast. My guest today, Bronwyn Williams. She is a futurist at Flux Trends. Bronwyn, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. And yourself?
No complaints. Listen, on the socials, when we put it up yesterday that we're going to be recording with you, I got some weird questions and I got some weird statements of people asking, what is a futurist? Is a futurist like someone that can tell, my fortune, or like has this magic crystal ball? So what exactly is a futurist?
Well, that's the first thing that I do like to talk to people about, because I'm a trained economist and also a futurist. And ironically, economists predict the future, but futurists mostly don't. There are a few exceptions, like my good friend Ian Pearson, Time Guide, who's one of the only futurists that actually does claim to predict things that are going to happen in the future. Generally, our role is to try and do kind of the opposite of forecasting. Forecasting, which is what economists and generally trained analysts do, is to sort of zero in on the most probable future so that you can sort of predict what's happening. Futurist role is actually kind of to do the opposite, to broaden out. So forecasting is about going beyond the probable into what is possible from both a negative and a positive context. And in that way, we're able to help the clients and the people that we work with, everyone from individuals all the way through to businesses and governmental organizations, to come up with sort of plan Bs and plan Cs to take advantage of opportunities that could be emerging that they haven't thought of, and also to prepare against threats that could be on the horizon.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting, because growing up, no young boy, well, let's not assume gender, boy or girl, says, I want to grow up to be a futurist. So how exactly do you go about deciding that you want to be a futurist? And then how do you, is there a futurist school like Hogwarts or something?
Well, I suppose it's actually not that new of a profession. If you're familiar with your old sort of people of the book, biblical sort of texts, you had prophets going on for a very long time, and that's exactly what prophets used to do, sort of warn people of if they don't change their ways, disaster is going to befall them. So we just sort of rebranded ourselves as time has gone along, and now we find ourselves more in the sort of business consulting space.
So less of the fire and brimstone and more of the give me your money, I suppose.
You say so, and yet are you watching what's going on with like the conference in Glasgow at the moment? It's literal fire and brimstone, right? We haven't changed that much. We have not changed that much.
Yeah,
the same old fear and envy that we sort of use to nudge people to sort of participate in the futures that we want or don't want going ahead. Human beings are remarkably consistent, and that's why we do tend to get a reputation of being people that can sort of tell the future. But it's not mystical at all. It's just sort of following the trends and going, human nature doesn't change all that much. But to answer your question about how you become a futurist, many futurists have come either out of the world of technology. So a lot of futurists have a technological background. They'd be technologists, because quite often people see that technology is sort of leading us into the future. I disagree with that worldview quite strongly. I don't think that technology dictates the future. I think that, quite frankly, humans dictate the future, and we adapt technology to our own ends. But that's the one sort of worldview. And quite a lot of other futurists come out of the marketing and advertising space, which also makes sense because they are in the business of basically changing people's behavior, which is what the role of a futurist is supposed to be. So in other words, the futurists are predicting the world and getting it correct. We're not doing our job very well, because the whole point is to help you to avoid threats or take advantage of opportunities that you wouldn't have if you hadn't engaged with us, which is quite interesting. But there are places you can go. They are sort of Hogwarts for futurists, although they will tell you in your very first lesson, you're not going to learn how to predict the future. You go to the economics department for that, straight away. University of Stellenbosch is one of the best programs. There's also the University of Hawaii, the University of Houston in Texas, and then, of course, up in Europe, they've got quite a strong futures sort of orientation. The University of Manchester, I've done a program through them, also very good. And you've also got Finland with VTT, one of the really good schools. Mostly at a postgrad level, they'd be doing this, and it would be sort of plugging into the strategic planning sort of ecosystem, but it's almost a pre-strategy phase. So you engage with the futurist before you start designing your strategy.
Okay, so for anyone that wants to pivot, they need to go and check that out. So in a 10-minute or 15-minute podcast, right, it's the segues are incredibly hard. Thank you for teeing me up into the next part of this podcast. trends and future trends. One or two. I know you like to speak on a very highbrow level. This podcast being very aggressively mediocre. I want you to unpack for us like one or two major world trends that are developing that people need to be aware of, but like on a smart toddler level.
Yeah, sure. So probably the big one that we've been looking at for this year, in fact, the theme that I called it when I was looking at the trends, would be the competing forces of both centralization and decentralization. And because I am sort of coming out of a trend analysis background, I do tend to look at things like trends, and trends always have sort of like an equal and opposite reaction. So when you see the world moving in one direction, you've also got to be looking to see that any sort of movement tends to sow the seeds of its own destruction within it. And this year has been quite interesting in terms of that centralization, decentralization space, whether you're looking at it from a geopolitical level, what's happening with both the sort of, on the one hand, a globalization in terms of response to crises like COVID and climate change, but also seeing new movements towards new regionalization in geopolitics. So new alliances like the Dragon Bear that Valina speaks about so well, like the mergers of like Russia and China getting together and kind of forming sort of a Beijing consensus to be the sort of counterweight to the Washington consensus that we've had in a very homogenous world. So again, there's like both those forces are in play there. And then of course, the one that people would be most familiar with, if you want the sort of clip notes to this, would be, of course, what's going on in the world of cryptocurrencies on the one hand, and then sort of modern monetary theory and central bank digital currencies on the other, which are into the
metaverse
kind of
we go. Into the metaverse we go.
And in the metaverse too, if you want to look at centralization and decentralization, you've got forces pulling towards having like one metaverse, like you have one internet, so that we're all able to access it. But that requires sort of like a platform. Yeah, and a single point of failure. On the other hand, you've got people pushing to sort of fragment the internet and the metaverse. I mean, the metaverse is really just sort of like the 3D version of the internet. So it's not all that complicated when you think about it. And you've also got sort of the firewalls coming up to the regional level, sort of fragmenting it. So you have these two opposing forces of centralization and decentralization that are causing quite a lot of destabilization.
Okay, cool. I think that's pretty straightforward. What's the other one?
Well, I think the other one is, of course, the move away from the Western sort of weird Western worldview. It's quite similar to the whole sort of reshuffling of the geopolitical sort of deck chairs, if you want to put it that way, going on. I don't know if you're familiar with the term weird. So sort of like Western, industrialized, educated, democratic, like that's the sort of
just
weird acronym.
Cool.
Because they're quite unusual.
Yeah.
So in terms of, and we do fall into this in South Africa too, we would form part of that worldview.
Well, we are weird.
We have adopted a lot of that sort of culture over there. And we're starting to see that those values are breaking down. In particular, the big one to look at is the value of individualization compared to collectivization. And again, that sort of fits into my biggest sort of picture on that centralization and decentralization force there. So we're seeing quite dramatic shifts towards more collectivist values, even in those much more westernized parts of the world, which have always been notorious for being hugely individualistic. That's also one to watch.
That's a very good one too, right there. Before I let you go, just quickly, like tech, right? You said that tech doesn't it's not pushing us, humans are pushing us, but tech is giving us a very big platform, right? To push our own brands and push our narratives. Enables, yes. So,
just like a drug dealer.
But that's the thing, right? Tech gives, but it also takes away. But one of the things that I've seen you being very vocal on is this whole concept, well, not concept, but ownership, right? It's like what tech do you actually own? If you go to Spotify and you stream your favorite music, I actually woke up yesterday and thought, I don't own any music anymore. I used to have CDs, there's things that I can touch and feel. I've got nothing. So yay for tech, but what is it actually doing to our ownership and like how we are thinking about ownership?
Exactly, it's a trade-off, right? So if you get access to something without having ownership of it, you get the benefits of having sort of economies of scale. So you have cheaper costs and more convenience, but at the same time, you lose a lot of agency. So there's always a balance to try and find sort of the sweet spot there.
Yes.
But without ownership, you kind of lose voting rights. And I use that in sort of like monkey ears there, because it's not a case of having literal voting rights. I mean, we don't live in like a feudal society where you have to own land in order to vote in physical elections. But if you don't have ownership, you don't actually have a more sort of metaphysical sort of vote over what happens to the community around you. And this comes to everything through to sort of land issues as to who actually owns the land, because that's the source of most wealth. It's also the source of most sort of power if you look at human history. And that hasn't changed even as we start plunging into the metaverse, but it also extrapolates to the metaverse, where essentially you're sort of renting your own identity. And as we start to build our own identities in the virtual space, whether it's through platforms like this, we're conversing now on Zoom, and you're going to publish this on LinkedIn, and you're going to publish it on Twitter.
Everywhere.
You don't own any of those platforms, which means you don't actually own your own creations, and what platforms give, platforms can take away, or at least change the terms and conditions of sort of overnight. So there's always a balance. That's not to say these things aren't useful, but they do come with terms and conditions, which we should probably consider, not just the ones that are written down, but also the ones that actually impact you going forward. Because essentially you're going to become a sort of tenant of your own creation, right? Like you can't have access if your identity, what do they say? And like, again, going back to sort of biblical text, sort of looking at your heart is where your treasure lies. If your treasure is in sort of virtual platforms and built around virtual networks, but you don't have access and control over them, you know, you are sort of setting yourself up for huge risk. There's a risk of catastrophic risk if those systems that you rely on fall apart. And of course, that is the human condition. Being human is a team sport, so be careful not to see these things in terms of black and white, but to see them rather in terms of balance and making sure that you're not giving away too much agency for too little convenience. Much like any sort of contract, you have to make sure that you're getting and that you're ensuring what you're getting when you get involved with these deals.
You touch on something interesting now, at the top of my head. You talked about land and voting rights and stuff. What is your take, or what's your opinion on people buying digital land in the metaverse through like things like Decentralization? I mean, I speak to people, and mostly the older generation just shake their head and say, this is insane. We don't get it. And that's the thing, is we don't get it. So what is your take?
The easiest analogy is to say these things are stocks with pictures, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, like you're still trading, but it's not investing. When you buy virtual land, you're not actually being an investor, you're being a trader, because you are trading on a speculative asset, an asset that only exists by common consensus. It exists purely based on sort of belief paradigm. So to sort of wear my more economist hat, we already have two sort of economies that economists have spoken about for a long time. You've got the real economy and you've got the financial economy. The difference between the real economy and the financial economy, in the simplest terms possible, is that the financial economy is claims on the real economy, but it is not the real economy. So it's the difference between the real economy is owning a business. The financial economy is sort of owning a loan that a company has, for example. So if you don't pay back your money, you could lose. The person that owns the claim in the financial realm gets to take over the real economy. And we can sort of see the sort of metaverse economy sort of almost being the sort of cubed version of that. So if the financialized economy is the real economy squared, because what the financialization of the economy does is increases those claims, increases the volatility of money, and also sort of makes it move faster, right? And also move in compound, because you can leverage and all those sort of things. We can kind of see the metaverse economy that's going on top of that. It's almost sort of like the economy cubed, right? So it's extrapolating another layer on top of the financialized economy. Now you've got the virtualized economy, which is sort of a claim on a financialized economy, which is a claim on the real economy. So we always have to understand that anything that we're doing in the virtual realm, although it can be used to accumulate wealth, that wealth is merely a claim on real assets. And it only becomes real when it is realized. In other words, when you sell your gains for something that you actually need, whether that is clothing or food or a piece of land or a house. This is the stuff that actually matters to us. And it will until or unless it becomes possible for us to sort of upload our consciousness to the metaverse. The real economy is all that really matters at the end of the day. And all the rest of it is just sort of gamifying who gets to win in the real world. So we've always got to kind of think about how it ties back down to the real economy and who's really winning. And of course, with anything, when it comes to investing in stock markets, your gains are only gains when you sort of cash them out, right? Exactly. So you can be a dollar trillionaire in cryptocurrencies or virtual land, but you know that market could crash tomorrow. And you only actually gain when you block those gains out. So I think that's worth sort of having pause for thought. That's not to say these things can't make you very, very rich overnight, but with every sort of opportunity for gain comes increased risk too. And when you're looking at the sort of compounding and the numbers that are going on there, the sort of overnight 1,000, even million% sort of gains that people are getting. Those are very big swings, and they could go either way. So don't gamble with money you can't afford to lose is always a sort of financial advisor's disclaimer, and I think it's worth thinking about. But if you've got the money and you got the time, by all means, go ahead. And if you're brave enough to get involved in this brave new world, always remember that even if it does sound irrational to you, where Keynes was right is in saying that the market can and will remain irrational longer than you can remain sane and solvent. Yeah. So why would you want to sit out if everyone is being crazy? As long as you believe that other people investing in this are stupider and more naive than you are, by all means, go ahead and take their money.
I love it. Fascinating. Bronwyn, thank you so much for joining us. If the listeners want to connect with you, where can they do that? And what else are you busy with?
Yeah, so they can get hold of me on Twitter. That's at Bronwyn Williams, or on LinkedIn. Again, Bronwyn Williams is the sort of hashtag URL there, so it's quite easy to find. I can't tell too much what I'm involved with, but I am going to be dabbling into some Metaverse economics projects, which will be announced pretty soon. Great. So watch this space, because it's time to stop sort of talking and time to start building things again, I think.
Amazing. To our listeners, peace, love, and prosperity, and we'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.